The notification came at 2047 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been lying awake anyway, the way I do most nights since my hip surgery last spring. That particular kind of restless where your body is exhausted but your mind keeps circling. The bedroom was dark. My wife's side of the bed was empty, which I'd stopped questioning months ago. She said she couldn't sleep with my movement, with the way I got up for water, with whatever else bothered her that week. I picked up my phone expecting nothing. A fraud alert from my bank. Unusual activity detected on joint account ending in 4471. Transaction of $47,200. Tap to review. I sat up slowly. My hip complained. I tapped the notification and stared at the screen for a long time. The transfer had gone to an account I didn't recognize. Executed at 11:18 p.m. while I was watching the news downstairs. While my wife was supposedly already asleep, I set the phone down on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling for a while. I want to be honest here because I think that's the only reason to tell a story like this at all. My first feeling wasn't anger. It wasn't betrayal. It was something much quieter and much worse, a kind of recognition. Like some part of me had been waiting for exactly this, and had simply run out of patience waiting. My name is Robert, and I was 63 years old the night I learned that my wife had been systematically moving our money out of our joint accounts for 11 months. We'd been married for 29 years. We met in Edmonton when I was 34, working as a structural engineer for a firm that did infrastructure contracts across Alberta. She was a bookkeeper at the time, which I always thought was a fine irony later. She understood numbers better than almost anyone I knew. She understood them well enough to know exactly how to move them without being noticed. We had a good life. I want to say that plainly, because I think people assume these stories are about bad marriages, about two people who should have quit years earlier. Ours wasn't that. We raised 2 children in a house in St. Albert. We took the kids to Dauphinot every summer until they were teenagers and started preferring their friends to us. We argued about the thermostat and whose turn it was to call the insurance company and whether the neighbor's tree was technically encroaching on our property line, the normal small friction of a shared life. After I retired at 61, things shifted. I noticed it, but couldn't name it. She'd always had her own friends, her own book club, her own routines. That independence had been something I admired about her. But there was a man from her yoga class. I'd met him once at a Christmas gathering she brought me to, a man named Gerald, maybe 55, recently divorced. The kind of person who holds eye contact a beat too long. I didn't think much of it at the time. I didn't want to think much of it. I was wrong not to. The morning after the bank notification, I made coffee before she came downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone and opened our banking app properly, not just the alert. I went back 11 months, the way you do when you're looking for something you're afraid to find. The transfers were elegant, in a way that only someone with her specific knowledge could manage. Never more than $50,000 at a time, which kept them below the threshold that would trigger an automatic flag. Spaced 3 to 6 weeks apart, sometimes from the joint savings, sometimes from the joint TFSA. She had signing authority on both, which I'd set up years ago when I had a contract in Fort McMurray and needed her to be able to handle things at home. By my count, sitting at that table with my coffee going cold, she had moved $318,000 out of our shared accounts. $318,000. I closed the app. I heard her footsteps on the stairs. I poured her coffee the way I always did. 2 sugars, a splash of the oat milk she'd switched to the previous year. And I set it on the counter and said good morning, and she said good morning back. And we stood in our kitchen in St. Free, Albert, Alberta, at 7 in the morning and talked about whether it was going to rain. I have thought about that conversation many times since. I don't know exactly what I was doing. Protecting myself, maybe, or protecting something I wasn't ready to let go of, or simply needing a few more hours to understand what I was dealing with before I did anything that couldn't be undone. But I drank my coffee, and I nodded at something she said about the neighbor's dog, and I did not say a single word about $1,318,000. I called my son that afternoon from my car in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire on the south end of town. He's 31, works in Calgary doing something with software I've never fully understood. He's always been the steadier of my two kids. Measured where his sister is, quick, careful where she is instinctive. I told him what I'd found. There was a silence on the line that went on long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "Dad," he said finally. "I know. Does she know you found it?" "No." Another pause. "Don't tell her yet. That was my son. No drama, no outrage on my behalf. Just immediate practical clarity. He told me to call a lawyer before I did anything else. He told me not to move money, not to confront her, not to change any passwords. Document, he said. Screenshot everything. Send it to him and he'd keep a copy off my devices. I sat in that parking lot for a while after we hung up. An old woman was loading bags into a Subaru 2 spots over. A teenager was pushing a row of carts back toward the entrance. The sun was doing that flat October thing it does in Alberta, bright but offering nothing. I drove home and acted like a man with nothing on his mind. The lawyer's name was Patricia. My son found her, a family law specialist in Edmonton, with a reputation, he said, for being very good at exactly this kind of situation. I met her 3 days after I found the transfers, in an office on Jasper Avenue with a view of the river valley and a particular quality of quiet that expensive offices have. She listened to everything. She asked questions that were precise and unsentimental, the kind of questions that cut through the story you're telling yourself and get to the facts underneath. How long had my wife had signing authority? Had I reviewed the accounts jointly at any point in the past year? Was the house in both names? What did I know about Gerald? The house was in both names. We'd owned it outright for 6 years, paid off the mortgage before I retired. It was worth, by the current market, somewhere between $780,000 and $820,000. Patricia tapped her pen against her notepad. "The accounts are the more urgent issue," she said. "The house requires both signatures to sell or encumber. She can't move the house without you. But the liquid assets," she paused. "She's been moving them for nearly a year. I want to know why she stopped. I hadn't thought about that. The last transfer I'd found was 6 weeks ago. And then nothing." "Maybe she has enough," I said. Patricia looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite something else. "Or maybe she's close to ready," she said, and decided to stop so the pattern wasn't too obvious when things started moving. I drove home in the dark thinking about that word, ready. Patricia moved quickly. In Canada, dissipation of marital assets, deliberately moving shared money to deprive a spouse, is treated seriously in family court, especially in Alberta. She filed an urgent application for a Mareva injunction, which is a court order that freezes assets to prevent them from being further dissipated before trial. Within 10 days of our first meeting, a judge had granted it. The joint accounts were frozen. Any assets held in my wife's name or Gerald's name that could be tied to the transferred funds were subject to accounting. I was home when she found out. She'd gotten a call, I assumed, from Gerald, or from a lawyer of her own. She came downstairs with her phone in her hand and looked at me across the living room, and whatever she was expecting to see on my face, panic or guilt or some version of the man she'd been married to for 29 years who deferred to her on financial decisions. It wasn't what she found. "You went to a lawyer," she said. "I did." "Robert, Patricia says you shouldn't call me directly about this," I said. "You should have your lawyer contact hers." She stood there for a moment. I thought about all the mornings I'd poured her coffee. I thought about the Edmonton Valley in October. Flat sunlight, nothing offered. I was going to explain, she started. I knew you were, I said. And then I went upstairs because I had nothing else to say that would make things worse, and I had learned in the past 2 weeks that the less I said, the better I was doing. The financial disclosure process took 4 months. Patricia had brought in a forensic accountant, a quiet man from Calgary named Dennis, who communicated almost entirely in spreadsheets and who had, apparently, a near-perfect record in asset tracing cases. Dennis followed the $318,000 through 3 different account transfers, a shell-numbered company incorporated in Alberta, and eventually into a joint investment account held in the names of my wife and Gerald. Gerald, it turned out, was not just a man from her yoga class. He had been her business partner for 8 months in a small property management company they'd set up together, funded largely. Dennis's spreadsheet was very precise about this, with $271,000 of the money moved from our joint accounts. His own financial situation was less stable than his confidence suggested. He had a mortgage on a property in Sherwood Park that he was behind on by roughly $64,000. He had a line of credit with a major bank that he'd maxed 2 years prior and been slowly servicing since. Patricia and Dennis between them painted a picture of a man who had found, in my wife, a solution to several problems at once. My daughter flew up from Vancouver when the disclosure was filed. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd drunk my coffee that first morning, and read through the summary document Dennis had prepared. And when she was done, she set it down very carefully, the way you set something down when you're trying not to throw it. Did you have any idea? She asked. Not specifically, I said. Generally, maybe. The kind of idea you don't let yourself have. She stayed for 5 days. She made me eat properly. She drove me to my hip physiotherapy appointment on the Thursday and sat in the waiting room reading a magazine and didn't say anything that needed to be said out loud. The part I haven't told yet is the part that took me the longest to decide. Dennis, going through Gerald's financials as part of the court-ordered disclosure, flagged the $64,000 mortgage arrears on his Sherwood Park property. The mortgage was held by one of the smaller credit unions in the province, not one of the big banks. Patricia mentioned almost in passing that a private party can sometimes purchase distressed debt from a lender if the lender has reason to believe default is likely. The lender would take a modest loss, but they'd be rid of the risk. The buyer would hold the note. I thought about that for 3 days. Then I called Patricia and told her to find out whether the credit union would sell. They would. Gerald was 4 payments behind and had made no credible arrangement to catch up. The credit union was, Patricia said, quietly relieved. I purchased the mortgage note for $61,000, slightly below the arrears value, which was standard, and became Gerald's mortgage holder on a property I'd never seen. My son called when I told him. "Dad," he said, and this time the pause was different. It's capitalism," I said. He laughed for a long time. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh properly in 4 months. I want to be clear about what this was and what it wasn't. I didn't do it out of cruelty. I did it because Patricia had explained to me that Gerald and my wife were planning to argue in the division proceedings that the investment company was a legitimate business venture and that the transferred funds were a form of informal loan. If Gerald's financial position collapsed before those proceedings, that argument became much harder to make. Dennis confirmed that the property in Sherwood Park was listed as a primary asset on Gerald's financial disclosure. If that asset was called, the argument fell apart. I'm 63 years old. I spent my career building things that were meant to last. Bridges, underpasses, the structural elements of things that people drove across and through and under every day without thinking about them. I understood load bearing. I understood what happened when you removed a foundation element. The mediation was in February in a building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and the particular kind of institutional neutrality that lawyers favor. My wife came with her lawyer. I came with Patricia. Dennis had submitted his full report. The Mareva injunction had held for 4 months. Her lawyer made several arguments. He argued that the transfers represented informal compensation for her management of household finances over the course of our marriage, a creative interpretation that Patricia had prepared for. He argued that the investment company had independent value, also prepared for. He argued that Gerald's involvement was incidental. Gerald's lawyer, sitting in a separate room down the hall because that's how these things work when the parties are hostile, had his own problems. Patricia had prepared a letter, through proper channels, informing Gerald that as the holder of his mortgage note, I was entitled to review his payment history and that I had concerns about his ability to service the debt going forward. I had not called the note. I had simply made my presence known. Gerald's lawyer spent most of his time dealing with that. The mediator was a woman in her late 50s named Brenda, who had clearly seen everything. She moved between rooms with the measured calm of someone who stopped being surprised by people approximately 20 years ago. At one point, she sat down across from me and Patricia and said very quietly, "You've been thorough." "I had good advice," I said. By the end of the day, the settlement terms were these. The $380,000 was to be repaid to me from the liquidation of my wife's assets, including her share of the investment company. The matrimonial home would be sold and proceeds split after accounting for the repayment. My wife would receive her portion of our RRSPs, as was her legal right. Gerald's property situation was his own matter. It was not a perfect outcome. 29 years don't end perfectly. There is no version of this where I walk out of a beige downtown building in February feeling like I've won something worth winning. But I walked out knowing exactly what had happened and exactly what I'd done about it. After 11 months of someone moving money out of my life in the middle of the night, that clarity felt like the most solid thing I'd stood on in a long time. I live in a condo in St. Albert now, on the 3rd floor, with a view of nothing particular. My son comes up from Calgary every month or so. My daughter calls on Sunday evenings. My hip has mostly settled. There are things I still think about in the quiet before sleep. Whether there was a moment I could have named what was happening earlier, before 11 months had passed and $318,000 had moved. Whether the general idea I'd refused to let myself have was a failure of courage, or just the ordinary human resistance to knowing something you can't unknow. I don't have a clean answer to that. What I have is this. I spent my career calculating loads. Stress tolerances, the point at which a structure, if not properly supported, will begin to shift in ways that aren't immediately visible. I was good at that work. I built things that held. I should have paid closer attention to what was happening in my own house. That's the honest version. Not a story about revenge or strategy or the satisfying mechanics of a mortgage note. Just a 63-year-old man who trusted the wrong things for too long and who eventually, when there was nothing left to avoid, started paying attention. Patricia sent me a note after the settlement was finalized. It said simply, "You were a good client. Take care of yourself." I read it twice, standing at my kitchen window in the new place, looking at the parking lot below, and then I put the kettle on and made tea, and that was the end of it. The thing I keep coming back to is the coffee. That first morning, knowing what I knew, I still walked to the counter and made her 2 sugars and a splash of oat milk. Some people might read that as weakness. I've thought about it enough now to think it was something else. The last instinct of a man who understood that how you begin a fight determines whether you win it. I didn't confront her. I didn't move money. I didn't change passwords or send a furious text at 3 in the morning. I called my son. I called Patricia. I let people who were better equipped than me in that moment do what they were trained to do. That's not passivity. That's the hardest kind of discipline there is, knowing when your emotions would destroy the very outcome you need, and choosing differently anyway. Gerald is the part of this story that says the most, I think. Not about my wife, about consequences. He walked into our marriage looking for a solution to his own problems. He found a woman who felt invisible, who felt like her contributions had gone unacknowledged, and he offered her something that felt like a beginning. I'm not without empathy for how that happens. But the money he used to build that beginning wasn't his. It belonged to 29 years of a shared life, groceries and dentist appointments and summers in Tofino, and all the 10,000 ordinary things that don't look like love until they're gone. When you build something on what you've taken from someone else, the foundation is already wrong. Gerald didn't cause his own financial collapse. He'd been doing that for years on his own. But the weight of what he participated in accelerated every crack that was already there. What I did with the mortgage note wasn't revenge. I want to be honest about that. It was load-bearing calculation. I spent my career understanding what holds a structure up and what brings it down. I applied the same thinking to the only situation in front of me. Patricia told me it was legal. Dennis told me it was logical. My own conscience told me it was proportionate. Those three things in alignment. I've learned to trust that. My son flew up twice during those 4 months. My daughter made sure I ate. I had good people around me, and I think that's the part of this I'd most want someone else to take from it. When things went badly wrong in my life, I did not try to be the smartest person in the room by myself. I found the right people and I listened to them carefully. That's a form of wisdom I didn't fully understand when I was younger. That knowing what you don't know and being honest about it is its own kind of strength. Patricia's note is still in my email somewhere. You were a good client. Take care of yourself. I think about what it means to take care of yourself, actually. Not as a platitude, but as a daily practice. It means paying attention to the things you'd rather not see. It means acting on what you know, instead of waiting for a more comfortable moment. It means building things properly, even when you're tired, even when it would be easier to take a shortcut. I didn't always do that in my marriage. I could have paid closer attention earlier. That's the part that's mine. But I paid attention when it counted. And then I made one phone call, and then another. And then I followed the advice of people who were better at certain things than I was, and I held my own nerve through 4 months of a process that was designed to be exhausting. That's not a story about winning. It's a story about not collapsing. Most of the time, those are the same thing.